Understanding the anatomy of a trout stream is the key to catching trout, because knowing where trout hold in a stream tells you where and how to fish for them. In the next hour, Rick Hafele will help you understand trout streams. He'll tell you where trout hold in them, what trout feed on, and how to apply this information to the selection of the right flies and the best methods of presenting those flies to the right places so you'll catch more and larger trout. Rick is a professional biologist with a master's degree in aquatic entomology, the study of streams and their insects. He's also an environmental consultant and a writer and lecturer about fly fishing. Rick's profession dovetails perfectly with his love of trout fishing. His detailed studies of trout streams and their insects resulted in the book Western Hatches, co-authored with Dave Hughes.
Before looking at the anatomy of a trout stream, let's look at the needs of a trout. Its needs will dictate where it will be found in the stream and will provide us with clues on how to catch it. The four basic needs of the trout are food, protection from currents, safety from predators, and what I call comfort, the temperature and oxygen content of the water. These basic needs will determine where we find trout. Trout are predators, but unlike bass and a lot of other fish, trout feed most of the time in many little bites, rather than a few large ones. This simple fact explains why fly fishing is such an effective way to catch trout. Their primary food includes aquatic insects, terrestrial insects, and small aquatic crustaceans, such as these scuds. Trout set up feeding lies to take this small fare and wait for their food to drift to them, unlike bass, which chase and ambush their prey. As trout get larger, they will seek out larger bites, like crayfish and sculpins. But even large trout do a lot of feeding on small insects. Trout live by a simple formula. The energy they receive from an item of food must be greater than the energy they expend to capture it. This explains why trout will sometimes refuse to move for a single insect. The energy required is simply too great. Throughout this tape, we'll see the implications of this formula in the fly selections and our fishing strategies. Trout are opportunists. This means they'll always take the easiest meals, and they're wary. They'll feed in absolute safety if they can, but they would chase a wounded minnow into 4 inches of water for a big bite. This explains in part why big flies, like woolly buggers, are so effective. The most active feeding periods of trout are tied to periods of the greatest insect activity. That's why an understanding of aquatic insects and other trout foods and how to imitate them is so important if you're going to catch trout consistently. Understanding the trout's food and reading water is the basis of fly fishing and is what makes it so challenging and so much fun on your home waters or on waters fished for the first time. Knowing where the needs of the trout are met is a matter of learning to read water. This knowledge tells you where to find trout and how to fool them all season long. All streams are unique and all have different anatomies, but no matter how large or how small they are, they can all be dissected into 4 basic water types: riffles, runs, pools, and flats. Trout travel between these types as their needs change and as water conditions change throughout the day and over the season. Learning to read water will help you find those prime lies where all of the trout's needs are met in one spot, a magic lie where you're most likely to find your largest trout. Let's begin our anatomy lesson in a riffle. Because riffles often hold lots of trout, and they are almost always feeding actively and opportunistically, trout in riffles are eager to take the right fly if it's presented in the right place and the right way. Riffles are especially good places to start fishing on unfamiliar waters. Riffles are usually the fastest water in a stream, tumbling down swiftly over rough bottoms of cobble and stone with the water 1 to 3 feet deep. The roughness of the bottom is reflected in the choppy, broken surface. This irregular bottom also provides protection from the currents for the trout and insects. This red dye shows just how slow the current can be on the bottom of a fast riffle. Trout and riffles are easy to fish for because they can't see well in the turbulent water. The choppy surface obstructs their view of what's floating overhead, and they can't see you well above the surface because the shallow water reduces their cone of vision. Trout and riffles must make quick decisions and take or reject the fly quickly. This makes riffles good places to fish when fishing is unproductive elsewhere. Let's look at the needs of the trout and see how they are met in a riffle. Food comes first, and riffles are the primary food-producing areas of a stream. They are rich in insect life because the shallow water lets in lots of sunlight and stimulates plant growth, food for insects. And the spaces between all the stones in a riffle make millions of little living rooms where the insects can hide from predators and get shelter from the current. In fact, it helps to understand aquatic insects if you remember that they have the same basic needs as trout: food, shelter from predators, protection from the current, and suitable temperature and oxygen levels. Here's a sample of nymphs and larvae taken from this riffle. All of these insects are well adapted to living in fast water. Mayflies, like these clinger nymphs, are very flat, have eyes on top of their head, and large oval gills on the abdomen. Clinging mayflies hang on so well that they're normally available to fish only during a hatch, when they let go of the bottom and rise to the surface to emerge. These stonefly nymphs crawl around on the rocks looking for plant debris and other insects to eat. They often get washed off the rocks and become food for the trout. These net-spinning caddis larvae, the kind that don't carry a case around on their backs, are abundant in most riffles. They are excellent to imitate because they often get swept off the rocks. They can't swim, and trout love to intercept something so helpless and easy to eat. Also, they are available to trout almost all the time. After sampling a riffle, you must decide what type of insect to imitate. Decide what are most abundant, most available to the trout, and most mature. Look for those that meet all three of these criteria. This is the key to selecting the best pattern. Trout and riffles need protection from the current. They can't afford to burn up all that energy unless there is food available in abundance. So if there's no hatch going on and there's no obstruction to break the current, trout will move out of a riffle and drop down into quieter water until insects become active. Let's look at some specific holding lies and analyze where we would expect to find trout in a riffle. This is Henry. He's got a lot of defects when it comes to being a trout. For instance, when you hook him, all he does is sulk, you break your tippet, lose your fly. But he's a great help when it comes to understanding the anatomy of a trout stream. Remember, as we spot Henry in various lies and riffles, that the biggest trout will hold wherever most of its needs are met. Those will be Henry's favorite lies. Here is Henry in very shallow water. He might feed here during a heavy hatch, but he'd be spooky and get out as soon as the hatch was over. Here is Henry in a deeper riffle. He'll feed less warily here, but he'll still look for shelter when food is scarce. I like to fish current seams like this, where a fast and slow current come together. It's a place where the food is condensed, as demonstrated by these marshmallows floating downstream. These areas can be prime feeding lies, but a fish won't hold here all of the time unless there is protection from the current and the water is at least 2 to 3 feet deep. Here is one of Henry's favorite lies. The boulder gives him relief from the current, the deep water and turbulence behind it protect him from predators, and the current delivers plenty of food. All of his needs are met right here. He'll stay until something moves him out or he's caught. Learn to recognize these places and search them out. To understand how to fish this riffle from bottom to top, let's look at the life cycle of the net-spinning caddis. That's what fish in this riffle are likely to be seeing and feeding on most. We'll fish imitations of the larva on the bottom, the pupa in mid-depths, and the adult is a dry fly right on the surface. The net-spinning caddis larvae build crude retreats out of leaves and gravel. They spin a spider-like net to filter particles of food out of the current. These larvae often abandon their shelters and drift downstream in large numbers. This is known as biological drift. and it functions to disperse the insects throughout the stream. Drift usually occurs most in the mornings and evenings, which makes nymph fishing very effective at these times. I like to fish patterns like this weighted number 12 caddis larva tumbled dead drift near the bottom, just like the natural does when it gets swept off the bottom in a riffle. Choose a fly pattern based on the size, shape, and color of the predominant insect and present the fly so it moves like the natural does. Because the water here is shallow, a floating line with a 9 or 10 foot leader tapered to a 4X tippet will handle this situation perfectly. I've slipped a strike indicator about 3 feet above the fly. Because the caddis larva is taken gently and it is fished on a slack line, the strike indicator will help me detect subtle strikes I might miss without it. An 8 to 9 foot rod allows you to control and mend your line easier than a short rod. And I like to use a reel with a smooth drag and large enough to hold your line, plus about 50 yards of backing. If you hook a fish in a riffle, it's probably going to head downstream. Position yourself so you work upstream through the riffle. This allows you to get closer to the fish, use shorter casts, and have greater control. You want to cover the water carefully and thoroughly, since fish can be spread throughout the riffle. But pay special attention to the current seams and eddies where fish are most likely to hold. Cast upstream or upstream and across with short casts of only about 15 to 30 feet. The upstream cast allows the fly to sink quickly to the bottom. When you cast, you need to strip in the slack line like this and raise your rod tip so the fly keeps drifting naturally along the bottom. Watch carefully for any hesitation of the strike indicator. Remember, these techniques will work for any nymph you want to fish dead drift right along the bottom, not just caddis larvae. Watch that strike indicator. There's one. Oh, looks like a good rainbow. Oh, is he making a run downstream? He took that larva as it drifted down right behind that rock in that current seam. You want to make sure you follow that strike indicator because it just hesitated slightly as that fish took. You really have to practice with these strike indicators, but once you get the feel for it, they can really be deadly. Yeah, he's about ready to come in. Okay, keep his head up. Good, rainbow. Oh, nice fish. Yeah, get that hook out. Okay, rest him up here a bit. Let him go so somebody else can catch that fish. Let's continue the life cycle of the net spinning caddis. As the larva of the caddis enters shelter, then transforms to the pupa. After 4 to 8 weeks, the pupa is fully developed, ready to cut out of the larval case and swim to the surface where the adult will emerge. Water temperature and day length are the major factors that trigger insect hatches. But exactly how thousands of insects trapped inside pupal cases can precisely time their emergence is still a mystery to biologists. Many caddis pupae swim actively to the surface to hatch. Others use a combination of swimming and air bubbles trapped inside their skin to help float them to the surface. This is the pupa of the net spinning larva. It's a typical caddis pupa, and when it emerges in the fast water of a riffle, its legs, antenna, and wing cases will all trail back along its sides. Trout concentrate their feeding on the pupa at first along the bottom, and then at the surface where the pupa struggle to break through the surface film. Trout take them there with quick, sometimes splashy rises. Remember, they're not taking dry flies. It's more efficient for them to feed on the pupa. The pupal stage is brief. Normally it takes only a few seconds for them to rise from the bottom to the top. But in those few seconds, they're extremely vulnerable to trout. This olive LaFontaine caddis pupa in a size 14 imitates it well. The antron yarn catches tiny bubbles of air and gives the fly the silver translucence of the natural pupa as it rises to the surface. These gas bubbles are produced by the insect to help it escape the pupal shuck. Once feeding activity is noted near or at the surface, it's time to switch to a subsurface presentation. Patterns fished just beneath the surface film can be drifted passively or fished with action, depending on the behavior of the natural insect you're imitating. There are a few net-spinning caddis hatching out here, and their pupa rise actively to the surface. So you want to position yourself at the top of the riffle and work down towards the rising fish. Because the pupa is fished right under the surface film, normally you'll see the strike. So you want to take your strike indicator off. My favorite way to fish the pupa is to cast down and across with a slack line. Let the fly sink a foot or so, and as your line swings below you, it'll come up to the surface just like the natural. You may have to mend your line like that to keep a belly from forming and dragging the fly across the surface. You can also lift your rod tip slowly like that to get the fly to rise towards the surface a couple times in one drift. It's most effective if you cast fairly short. 25 to 30 feet is about as far as you want to cast. Oh, boy, he hit that pupa as it's rising to the surface with a real thud. Woo! That's what makes this so exciting when you're fishing these pupa. They just really come up and nail it. Now, he's not as big as Henry. In fact, I think Henry could make a good meal out of this guy, but brown trout. There he comes. All right. Oh, ground trout are just gorgeous. Red spot. To complete the life cycle of the caddis, let's look at the adult stage. Once the adult caddis escapes the pupal shuck, it flies quickly to streamside vegetation. Caddis are easily recognized by their tent-shaped wings. They have long antennae and no tails. Shaking branches will quickly tell you if caddis adults are present. You can recognize them by their quick and erratic flight. Caddis flies mate on the foliage, after which the females fly back to the water to lay their eggs, usually in the evenings. They dip their abdomen to the water's surface, or they swim underwater to lay their eggs directly on the bottom. Adults swimming underwater are encased in a bubble of air that gives them a shiny, silvery appearance. The LaFontaine diving caddis is designed especially to imitate the caddis adult, air bubble and all, as it dives underwater. Fish it up and across and let it swing to the surface to imitate the adult caddis returning from the bottom after laying its eggs. This elk hair caddis will match the adult stage of the caddis on the surface. The elk hair caddis works well in riffles because it floats well and is highly visible, while still providing a good silhouette of the natural caddis. Some of the best caddis fishing with dry flies occurs when adults are laying eggs. With 2 or 3 color and size variations of the elk hair, you can fish nearly any caddis hatch anywhere. This looks like an excellent riffle for fishing the dry elk hair caddis. It's about knee deep, and it's got lots of rocks and boulders breaking up the current. I like to work upstream, casting up or up and across, so your fly will drift back naturally without drag over the fish. Keep your casts within 35, 40 feet, so you have good line control. If you see fish rising, cast about 2 feet in front of them, so your fly will drift over them. Otherwise, fish the good holding water, the slicks and flat water behind the rocks, and those current tongues or eddies between the rocks. That's where the fish are likely to be holding. I like to make 5 or 10 casts to a specific area and then move on. This way I can cover lots of water, get my fly over quite a few fish in this riffle. One thing you want to make sure is that your fly doesn't drag in the current. You can prevent drag by stripping in the slack line as the fly drifts towards you like this, or you may need to make an upstream mend like that as the fly drifts down. You'll just have to decide which technique will work best for the water you're fishing, but you want to make sure your fly is floating naturally. There's a rise. He's got it. Sitting right in that slack water behind that boulder. Boy, in these riffles, that's one of the best places to find a fish. They'll sit back there and sip in the bugs that come down and cast right up in the top. Get your fly to come down with a nice drag-free float, and you can really catch some nice fish. Oh, it's rainbow. Yeah, okay. Let's get him in here. Come here. Ah, handsome fellow. Good 14 inches. There. That's more like it. Just rest him up a bit. I think there's some more fish like that out there in this riffle. Let's go see. Let me show you two other techniques that are really effective when you're fishing the dry elk hair caddis. The first, just let your dry fly drift down below you and pop it under the water so it'll drift like a wet fly just under the surface. This imitates a natural adult that would be swimming underwater to lay its eggs. The other technique is to flutter your caddis or skate it over the surface. A lot of caddis are real active and they just kind of hop and skate over the water. So you just want to skate that fly right over those feeding lanes behind the rocks, just like that. Just pull it through, get it to skate. Always set up a pattern and cover all the water in a riffle, but pay special attention to prime feeding lies as you come to them. If you wade right out to prime feeding lies first, you will spook trout holding in other parts of the riffle, and they will charge over and spook the fish in the prime feeding line. The life cycle of the caddis, larva, pupa, and adult, shows you why you have to be prepared to fish at all levels of the riffle, bottom, mid-depths, and on top, because fish feed at all those levels. If mayflies or stoneflies were abundant, mature, and available, you should use many of the same tactics, but with different patterns. Trout move as conditions change. If there is no insect activity in the riffle, or there's no holding water there, then the trout will drop down into the run below, where their needs for comfort and cover are met in the deeper water. Runs are important parts in the anatomy of most trout streams. They're deeper than riffles, from 3 to 6 feet deep, and generally have less drop and slower currents. Their bottoms often have large rocks and boulders. Another key difference between riffles and runs is the surface. Runs are smoother, with an occasional boil, but without the choppy aspect of a riffle. As a rule, runs are positioned between a riffle and a pool, but this is a rule that rivers often break. Not all riffles turn into runs, and not all runs turn into pools. Runs meet the needs of trout differently than riffles do. The deeper water of a run provides more safety from predators, and the slower currents give more comfort. In fact, trout often back out of riffles to rest in runs when insects aren't active. So if you're not catching fish in riffles, runs can be an excellent place to fish if you can read them correctly. There are specific types of water in runs than they do in riffles. This means they aren't as likely to be sprinkled around. So you have to read the water more carefully to be sure you aren't fishing the barren stretches. Let's let Henry, our cooperative but lethargic trophy trout, show us where he would be happiest in a run. Again, his favorite lies will be chosen based on where the water meets most of his needs in one place. One thing that makes runs tough to fish and attractive to trout is that many of the best lies are often far under the surface and not easily apparent to the angler. One of Henry's favorite lies in a run is up at the head, where a riffle feeds into it or a pool empties. He has the advantage of lots of food here, but also the security of deeper water. Henry likes the edge of any current, or a place where two currents meet, because that's always a place where food gathers, both on the surface and along the bottom. If you imagine this dye were drifting insects, you can see where the food would be concentrated. Rocks, boulders, ledges, logs, or other obstructions that break the current are prime lies that should be fished thoroughly and carefully. It's easy to overlook the banks along the edge of a run. Nearly everybody does, but they offer special places for trout, such as this undercut, and are an important part of the anatomy of any river. The typical way to find a run is with no visible fish feeding activity, but that doesn't mean trout won't take a properly presented fly. When no insects are hatching, trout and runs are not likely to come to the surface to take an insect or a dry fly. It's simply not worth the energy required to come to the surface for a single bite of food, especially for a large trout. Trout still feed opportunistically in runs, but because the water in a run is less turbulent, they get more of a chance to study the natural insect or the fly pattern chosen to imitate it, so your fly should be a closer imitation. A net sample from a run contains many of the same insects we found in a riffle, but usually there are fewer types of insects because of the deeper water and less sunlight penetration. These crawler mayfly nymphs are often abundant in runs. They are awkward critters and can hardly swim. They're a favorite mouthful for trout. Pebble-case caddis are also often abundant in runs. In this stream, stoneflies appear predominant. They find a bouldery bottom perfect habitat and provide prime grocery for trout. Stonefly species vary in size from half an inch long to over 2 inches long. The large species mature over a 2 to 3 year period, so their nymphs are available to trout all year round, not just when they are emerging. Because of this, stonefly nymphs can catch trout almost any time of the season in runs. Stoneflies, unlike caddis, have no pupal stage. They have incomplete metamorphosis. When they are ready to emerge, nymphs migrate from the stream bottom, crawling all the way to shore and out of the water onto a stone or up the trunk of a tree. The nymphal skin splits open and the adult hatches out. Nymphal migrations may go on for a week or two. Trout are aware of it and eagerly accept the correct imitation if presented properly. Examine banks carefully to see if shucks are present. Learn when stoneflies emerge in your streams and plan to be there. Most stonefly nymphs can't swim, so an effective way to fish a run is with a weighted nymph, dead drifted right along the bottom. Select your pattern based on the size, shape, and color of the most abundant stoneflies in the run. This follows the primary concept in fly fishing for trout. Select a pattern based on what the fish feed on most, and use tactics based on how that feed comes to them in the currents. This is a fairly shallow and slow run, and you can fish here effectively with a floating line by casting upstream and mending like that. You want to use an 8 to 10 foot leader so your fly will get near the bottom where the fish are. When you move to deeper and faster runs, you have to use other techniques to be effective. This looks like an excellent run. Has a good fast current at the head of it and a lot of boulders and rocks in the bottom for fish to hide behind. Then as you drop down to the lower portion of the run, the current slows down, but you still have the rocks and boulders there for fish to hold by. A wet tip line is often necessary to get your fly to the bottom in deep runs. You could use a 5-weight system here, but if you plan to fish a large stonefly nymph, a 7-weight system is more effective and comfortable and will get your fly to the bottom faster than a 5-weight system. Remember, getting your fly to the feeding level of the fish is the secret to success. You'll need a variety of wet tip lines, ranging from high D to high speed high D in addition to your floating line. I like to keep mine on extra spools marked on the back, so I'll be ready to use them anytime I need them along the stream. This allows you to fish from top to bottom, wherever the fish are feeding most actively. Many people make the mistake of fishing wet-tip lines with too long of a leader. It should be short, only about 3 to 5 feet long. This keeps the leader from buoying the fly back up towards the surface. I'm going to start by fishing ahead of the run. This is a good place to begin because you've got a lot of current bringing in food and there's good boulders and structures up here. I'm using a weighted nymph because I want to fish it right down along the bottom where the naturals are. My position here allows me to cast just upstream and bring that fly along the bottom deep right in front of me and just downstream from me. This is an excellent place for fish because the water drops from about 2 feet deep to about 4 to 5 feet deep right out in this little shelf. By casting upstream and letting that fly drift down, I'm getting it real deep right in front of me and just below me. You need to mend your line and raise your rod tip as it comes towards you, and then lower your rod tip as the fly drifts away, just like that. Make short casts so you can feel the strike. There'll just be a slight hesitation, and that's all. Using a roll cast, that's one of the best casts you can use with this wet tip line and heavy nymph. All you have to do is when it straightens out below you, lift your rod tip up, flip the line and the fly upstream, just like that. And let that fly sink right down near the bottom. You want it to be deepest right out in front of you. There's one. There's a nice fish. And there he jumps. Good jump. Oh, that's a dandy. Beautiful fish. Woo! Yeah. Took right down near the bottom. Nice rainbow. That wet tip line is really important too. It really helps get that fly near the bottom where the fish are at. I'm going to bring him into the slow water right behind this log here to land him. Not a bad fish. Right in the net. Be creative. Do whatever the water calls for to achieve a dead drift along the bottom. Fish and runs are not always actively feeding or even interested in feeding. As a fallback tactic, fish a walloper of a streamer across the run. Trout are opportunistic, and they might find it harder to resist a fast-moving streamer than a dead drifted nymph. In dissecting a run, it is easy to overlook its banks. Banks are the transition line between the aquatic and terrestrial environments. Aquatic insects in the adult stages congregate along banks, waiting their time to deposit eggs, like this adult stonefly. Of course, a lot of terrestrials can be expected to fall into the water there, especially on warm, windy summer days. These include ants, grasshoppers, jacids, and beetles. It looks like this might be a good time to try a hopper pattern. As trout grow larger, or as conditions of extreme high and low water force them out of runs and riffles, they drop down to seek cover, shelter, and bigger bites in pools. It's a paradox that pools are the best place in almost any river to fish for its largest trout, yet no water is fished less effectively by fly fishermen. Pools are often intimidating and perplexing. The water is often deep and slow, and trout don't readily show themselves. Trout here also have ample time to inspect your fly, and every presentation error is magnified. Pools are the part of the anatomy of a stream where the water slows, sometimes almost to stillness. They are important sanctuary water in nearly every creek, stream, or river. Pools are the primary holding and feeding areas for the largest trout in a stream because their needs are all met there. The need for safety is met by the depth of the water. The need for comfort is met by the laziness of the current. The trout's need for food is satisfied in pools by things that come in bigger bites. Another reason big trout like them. There are aquatic insects in pools, of course, but larger trout are happier to encounter such beasts as crayfish, sculpins, leeches, trout fry, and minnows. If you look carefully, you can see that pools have their own anatomies. By learning to read them, you can break them down into their parts and fish each part the way they should be fished. The three major parts of a pool are the head, where a run or riffle feeds into the pool, the body, where the water is deepest and slowest, and the tail out, where the water shelves up to break over into the riffle or run below. Let's spot some of the places where we would expect fish to hold in a pool and analyze why we would expect them to hold there. This is the head of a pool. Trout lie in the bottom, along current seams or in eddies, and wait for food washed down from above. This is an area where food is concentrated. You can fish the head of a pool with the same techniques as the run above it if you can position yourself correctly. Too few people change their tactics when moving from riffles and runs to the body of pools. So when they fish there, they don't get their flies to the feeding level of the fish or retrieve them the way the fish in pools are used to seeing their natural food arrive. You must change your thinking and fishing pace to match the character of the water. Methodically cover the water, all the while watching for a big fish to reveal itself. Pools sometimes offer excellent dry fly fishing. Mayflies drying their wings, for example, will drift down from the riffles above to waiting trout. When there is no hatch, however, a streamer fished deep through the body of the pool can be deadly. Choose patterns that suggest big bites. Marabou muddler is a good imitation of the bait fish, and their breathing action is excellent in the still waters of pools. Fish in pools are hunters and take any available food. Streamers take advantage of this opportunistic behavior. You want to start fishing pools at the top and work down. Use a wet tip or a sinking line so your flies will get near the bottom. I like to cast down and across or up and across to vary the depth of retrieve. Upstream casts will sink deeper. After you cast, you need to throw in some slack line so your fly will have time to sink. As the fly sinks below you, then you can start stripping so the fly darts across the current. This is the most effective part of the cast and when you're most likely to get your strikes. Strikes when you're using streamers will often be hard and vicious because those fish don't want the fly to escape. Some of the best times to fish pools are in the mornings and evenings because this is when their food is most active. When they hit these streamers, you usually can feel it pretty good. There we go. Oh, that's a good one. Oh my gosh. Boy, they really take off on some runs in these deep pools sometimes. They don't jump too often. I'll tell you, they'll really burn your finger if you aren't careful. There we go. Get over here in a little quieter water. He's going to stay out there in the bottom for a while. Sulking. That feels like a good fish. Get him up out of the bottom. Oh, there he goes. Going back down in that deep water in that pool. They like to stay down there in the bottom. Over here in a little shallower water. There we go. Well, that's a strong fish. Oh, it's finally coming up from the bottom. Oh, it's a brown trout. Wow, you never know what you're going to get from these pools when you're fishing these big streamers. Let's give me the net here. There. Looks like 16 or 17-inch fish. All right. These brown trout are so beautiful. They're really nice to look at. There we go. Okay, let's rest him up here a bit. I bet he's going to head for the bottom of this pool and wait for the next big streamer to come along. Fishing a pool is a little like fishing a pond or lake. You've got to experiment with 3 factors until you find a combination that trout like. The factors are the fly, the depth you fish it, and the speed and motion you give it. When you find a fly and depth and retrieve that takes fish, stick with it. Trout in pools can often be spotted and stalked, especially when they're cruising and hunting for food themselves. By spending time carefully observing your home waters, you can learn where the biggest trout live. Get a high vantage point, wear Polaroid sunglasses and a hat that blocks the sun, and be infinitely patient. A trout that's worth fishing for won't show itself to the impatient. Trout are camouflaged. You've got to look for them as slight darkenings along the bottom, or wavy movements in the current, or even as shadows on the bottom when you can't see the fish themselves. Also look for a tail movement, or a white mouth opening and closing. Don't expect to see a whole fish. Big trout in pools are easiest to spot when they drop back to feed on insects in a tail out. When this happens, all the rules of matching the hatch apply. In fact, fishing the tail of a pool is a lot like fishing a flat. There he is. Nice fish. Woo, took that spinner just as it came down over his head. You got to get a good drag-free drift. And when you get hooked on a size 20, 22, you can pull them out real easily. Oh, that was a nice fish, too. Woo! Flats are among the most exciting parts of a stream to fish, but they are also one of the most challenging places to fish. At times, fish can be surprisingly easy to catch, while at other times, flats equal frustration. But if you can learn to understand their anatomy, you can tip the odds in your favor. Flats are similar to riffles in depth, from 1 to 4 feet deep. But the surface of a flat is even and smooth, reflecting the smoother nature of its bottom. The current speed in a flat can vary from very slow, almost still, to relatively fast. Flats meet the needs of a trout for food and comfort, but unless they have weed beds or overhanging vegetation, they offer trout little security from predators. The shallow, clear water exposes fish to danger from above. Food is often concentrated in flats, making them energy-efficient places for trout to feed. The favored feeding lies of trout in flats are related closely to the favored habitat of the insects. As usual, the largest fish will take lives that meet most of their needs in one place. On flats, these are feeding lanes located near some sort of cover. When trout feed actively in flats, you can see them working, and you don't need to read the water to locate them. But you do need to read the water in order to make the proper presentation, and you need to select the fly that imitates the stage of the insect the fish are feeding on. Flats like riffles provide lots of food for insects, and the insect populations are often dense. This results in concentrated hatches, intense feeding periods by fish, and provides great fishing opportunities for the prepared fly fishermen. It's a good idea to take an aquarium net and get a sample of what is available to the trout. Then you must carefully observe the trout to determine which insect and its stage they are taking. Midges hatch in great numbers in slow flats. The pupal stage hangs vulnerably in the surface film and is the stage most often taken by feeding trout. Simple dressings to imitate them, such as this number 18 olive midge pupa, should be fished with a dry line and a leader that is greased to within 6 to 8 inches of the fly. Small crustaceans, such as these scuds, are very important in flats with extensive weed beds. Trout will nose into a bed of weeds and root scuds loose. Scud imitations can be simple ties and fish dead drift in channels through the weed beds. Mayflies, as we have seen, are found in all parts of the anatomy of a trout stream, and along with midges, they are often the predominant insect in flats. The swimmer mayfly nymphs, such as this beetus or blue-winged olive nymph, find the moderate currents and heavy weed growth of flats the perfect home. Although it may appear trout are taking duns, they are more often feeding on emerging nymphs. In fact, fishing a dry fly when the trout are on emergers is one of the most common mistakes of fishing flats. The surface film presents a tough barrier to hatching mayfly nymphs. This has been compared to a person trying to push up through 3 feet of dirt. Trout, especially on flats, feed eagerly just under the surface, taking the emergers struggling in the film. A head and tail rise is a good clue that fish are feeding under the surface rather than on it. This surface film emerger, imitating the hatching blue-winged olive nymph, is the perfect imitation for this stage of the mayfly's life cycle. Be sure to match your tackle to the conditions. A 5-weight line is an excellent choice for fishing flats when there's no wind. Matched with a leader of soft tippet material, in this case I have a tippet of 6X, 3 to 4 feet long, it's the perfect choice for getting the gentle presentations required on flats. I like to grease the leader from the butt to within a few inches of the fly to help suspend the fly in the surface film. When you're fishing flats, whether you're using a dun, a spinner, or a surface film emerger like I'm using now, you want to pick out the fish that you're casting to. You want to find a rising fish and pick out the largest fish that's rising if there's a group of them. You want to position yourself very carefully in flats too. You need to work above the fish carefully without spooking them, so you're casting downstream towards them at about a 45-degree angle. This will help your fly drift over them without any drag. You want to cast about 1 to 3 feet above the rising fish. You want to make sure it floats over the fish without drag, so you can use a reach cast like that, or you might want to try a serpentine cast, where you put little waves in the line so the fly will drift 4 or 5 feet without any drag. Once that fly passes over the fish, you want to let the current swing it out of the feeding lane before you pick it up for your next cast, so you don't spook it. You can keep working the fish as long as he keeps rising consistently, and observe very carefully just exactly what he's feeding on and the type of insect he's taken. Good fish. Letting that fly float dead drift right over the top of him on a slack line. There's a lot of weeds in here using light tippets. You gotta follow them down sometime to get them out of the weeds. That's a strong fish. Don't want to put too much pressure on him. They'll break this tippet real easily. I don't know if he's gonna come up and jump. He's right down in the heavy weeds. We're gonna play him nice and gently, get down here in the slower water. Here he comes. There he is, get him in. Oh, boy. Well, when you're using those tiny flies on flats, it's awful easy for them to pull out. But I'll tell you, hooking them is a greater challenge than landing them. Whew. The next stage in the life cycle is the newly emerged mayfly called a dun. Duns look like tiny sailboats, and no matter the species, they will all have the same shape, although they vary widely in size and color. Look carefully at the color of the dun's underside. This is the side the trout see, and it's often a lighter color than the top. Duns ride the surface to dry their wings before they can fly away. Sometimes they will float a foot or two. However, on rainy and windy days, they may float as much as 50 feet. When they ride the surface, duns are helpless. They're at the mercy of the currents, and the trout know it. They take up favorite feeding stations and feed with leisurely rhythmic rises. The rise form when trout are taking duns instead of emergers is more of a sipping rise than a head and tail rise, and a bubble is often left on the surface where the insect was. This size 18 blue-winged olive comparadun is the perfect match for the duns fish are taking now. Mayfly duns that escape feeding trout fly to nearby vegetation, where they molt in a day or two into a spinner, the last stage in the mayfly's life cycle. A spinner is the sexually mature mayfly and can be recognized by their bright, clear wings. Males form the swarms that you see dancing over the stream, usually late in the afternoon and in the evening. When a female flies into a swarm, mating occurs in the air, after which the female drops to the water to lay her eggs. Females dying on the surface creates a spinner fall, and trout feed on them with tiny but persistent dimples. Sometimes spent spinners are very hard to spot on the water, and many fishermen overlook them entirely. Underwater, from the trout's view, however, they are easily seen. The tackle and tactics for fishing spinners or duns are the same as those used for the emerger. You want to position yourself upstream of the fish and cast down towards it. Now, when fish are feeding near the surface, they have a very small window. This means they're only seeing the insects in a 2 or 3 inch area over them. This is a very energy efficient way to feed when there's a heavy hatch. But for the fly fisherman, it means you must get your fly exactly down that feeding lane to be effective. Cast that right down the feeding lane. He just took one right ahead of it. There he is. Boy, that downstream cast really pays off on these flats. That's a hot fish. Goes over to the bank. Woo. Uh-oh. He's going over by those logs, branches, underneath those willows. Go down and get him. He's still over there by the branches on these willows. We'll work down and try and land this fish before he gets snagged. Downstream cast really pays off. Nice jump. Come on, baby. Here he comes. A lot of weeds in here, too. That can really get snagged in those with these fine tippets. Awful hard to land these fish in flats like this. There. Here he comes. Bring him into the net. Yeah. Nice rainbow. Let's get this hook out of this beautiful fish here. There we go. Beautiful rainbow. Let him go and be a challenge for someone else to catch on this flat. An awareness of the anatomy of a stream and the needs of the trout will tell you how to read the water and how to respond as conditions change. The best place to develop this knowledge is on your home waters. Take the time to learn to spot fish, study their movements, and understand their behavior. When fishing is slow, practice your techniques and sample and observe the insect life so you will be ready when the fish are. Also plan a strategy for fishing a piece of water. Determine the best casting position based on the type of food being imitated. Select the proper fly and present it to imitate the natural's behavior. By fishing the high percentage places at the right times with the correct flies and proper tactics, you will consistently catch more and larger trout.